Unlike the P3 manga, which I previously covered in this series, Shuji Sogabe adapted P4 in a much more standard, chronological fashion. I suppose it's partly down to the characters' development in 4 coming largely in their introductions to obtain their personas, and all subsequent development coming in optional social links instead of as part of the central narrative. That and the P4 manga's release didn't get screwed over the way P3's did. It's certainly easier to follow and makes for a work that can stand on its own without relying on the reader being familiar with the story already. But that doesn't mean this manga doesn't have a number of interesting things to discuss, most of which are kinda negative. The first is how the protagonist can feel like a near irrelevant side character in his own story with a slight change of perspective. Sogabe admits in notes early on to really liking Yosuke. This much is apparent from him becoming the POV character for the duration of the third TV world visit where he acquires his persona. From here, Yosuke is the one making deductions and pushing the team forward, effectively taking the leadership role from Yu, or Soji as is known here. Sure, this may reflect the game where Yu is a silent protagonist, necessitating the others voicing advancements in the case in his place. However, this is more problematic in an adaptation since the character's quiet disposition is much less acceptable when the audience can't control any of his actions. The end result is that Soji barely registers as a character. If he was established as being quiet, a bit of a loner who doesn't speak much like the P3 protagonist, it could have worked since Minato didn't have this issue, but Soji really suffers from a lack of characterization. He's significant because he's the first to get a persona and has the wildcard ability, which he never fucking uses. If not for the story opening with his arrival in Inaba, one could be forgiven for thinking Yosuke was the protagonist. A good example of this comes midway through Volume 3. The team have just rescued Kanji and Yosuke is freaking out that they've not got any real leads in solving the case. The others then speak words of encouragement towards him, including Soji. This is the kind of scene you'd typically centre around the protagonist, but it's centred on Yosuke instead. I think part of this comes from the nature of the characters pushing things forward in the games. In P3, the player is mostly being told what to do by their senpai and Ikutsuki. In P5, Morgana, Makoto, and the group's need for a unanimous decision are what compensate for Joker's quiet nature. But the P4 cast don't have any kind of mentor, senpai, or other authority figure. They do this on their own, and it's the 4 founders who are older than the rest that have to take charge. But keeping Soji quiet forces the other 3 to take charge in his stead. This is the one where fleshing out the protagonist is the most vital, because if he doesn't take charge, he feels like an inconsequential bonus character instead of the main character he's supposed to be. And considering how he's the character with ties to the Velvet Room and the Wildcard, the final kidnapping victim, the human and supernatural antagonists, and that he's the one the team's navigators most respect, it's kind of important that you stand out from the rest. The anime handled this much better by giving you a defined goofball personality and a lot of great lines, but the manga gives him so little that the group's realization in the summer that he'll be going home in a few months holds no emotional weight because you often forget he's even here. Soji has no character until Nanako gets kidnapped. Then he impatiently goes into Namatame's TV with Teddy while Naoto stays with Dojima and the rest of the team go through Junes, so Naoto doesn't get to help during the first dungeon she's a part of the team for, and Yosuke leads the team to help and basically beats Namatame himself because the author couldn't help himself. And there's some unfortunate knock-on effects with Soji's lack of personality. Rise's huge crush remains intact here, but while the game leaves enough room for Yu's leadership and cool take-charge attitude to be inferred through gameplay, and the anime actively shows it, Soji just shields her briefly in her dungeon and that's kind of it. He barely says or does anything, so Rise's crush on him feels a lot more shallow in the manga. Speaking of Rise, she's a good example of another issue. Social links in this manga, as with most Persona adaptations, are largely non-existent, but key moments from at least party member S-links will be reworked to fit into the more streamlined retelling. One example of note is the scene where Rise, after becoming depressed upon hearing that Kanami Mashita is becoming the agency's new #1 idol, encounters Nanako and asks her what she thinks about Kanami. Nanako simply says that she prefers Rise, the idea being that Nanako knows Rise as a person, while she only knows Kanami by reputation and through her TV persona as Kanami. She likes Rise Kujikawa more than Kanami. It's a big moment that helps Rise develop through the rest of her S-link. In the manga, however, it doesn't hit the same. The manga moves the equivalent scene to immediately after her rescue from the TV world. She's not even shown being inducted into the team before we get this moment. Now, the English translation of the manga drops Rise's idol name, Risette/Risechi, and just calls her Rise all the time. As such, it's difficult to say without any scanlations if Nanako is supposed to simply recognise Rise as the idol from TV, or if she's met her before now. Since the game scene is around halfway through her S-link, you're guaranteed to have had Rise meet Nanako at least once or twice before then, so the message behind Nanako's words is clear. In the manga, it's hard to tell if that's still supposed to be the case, since without those prior interactions setting them up as friends, it really comes off like Nanako is saying she prefers Risette over Kaname rather than preferring Rise Kujikawa over Kaname. Couple this with how Rise's crush comes across here, and she's a much weaker character than in the game. And speaking of much weaker, Naoto Minato doesn't go into the Namatame dungeon with the others. She stays with Dojima, her first dungeon as part of the team, and she doesn't go. Then she and the other girls fight Adachi first. Each one gets battered and unlocks their secondary persona, getting one hit in each, before he unleashes his persona and beats them all in one go. Naoto gets one attack in with her base persona in the entire manga. Then Soji comes in and fights Adachi and the other guys help out while the girls do nothing, just like in the Kubo fight, except that was Yosuke doing the heavy lifting because of course it fucking was. But unlike Soji, Yosuke could actually win the fight by his own power, while Soji can't beat Ameno Sagiri until Adachi lent him Magatsu Izanagi. My next issue isn't strictly an issue with the adaptation and more the framing of scenes. Scenes where the group talk about the current situation are very commonly done with a string of word balloons that give no indication of who is speaking at any given time, unless you can pick up on a minor aspect of their personality or language. Maybe the characters have more distinct manners of speech in the Japanese version, which don't translate into English, but whatever the case may be, the scenes become a blur of exposition that blends all the characters together and takes away their personalities. It's fine in the game or anime since you can hear the voices even if they aren't on screen, but the manga obviously doesn't have that. Granted, a lot of the dialogue is along the same lines as that heard in the game, if not outright identical in the Japanese version, so it's possible that the author is again assuming readers are already familiar with the game, but expecting them to recall exactly who says what line in lengthy dialogue scenes is a far cry from expecting them to recall the broad strokes of the narrative well enough to not get lost when viewing scenes out of order. The final topic is much less of a criticism, fortunately. It relates to how the characters' shadows are dealt with. In the game, all party members, bar you, are faced with their shadow, a manifestation of a part of themselves they don't want to admit is there. When they reject it, it becomes its own being and transforms into a boss monster. Upon its defeat, the character is forced to accept it as part of themselves, and that self-actualization manifests in their shadow becoming a persona. The manga changes this. The character will have that moment of acceptance during the battle instead. This way, the character can obtain a persona to help the others to defeat their shadow. This does weaken the metaphor somewhat, as the rampaging aspect of themselves has already been accepted but is still on the loose. However, the benefit of the change is that the character gets to help defeat their own shadow that now threatens their friends. One could view this as changing the metaphor from the side of themselves they reject being brought under control with help from their friends, to them having to bring that part under control themselves to stop it from hurting their friends. I can't say which one I prefer or is better for the story since both have their strengths and weaknesses. And that's the P4 manga. It took me so long to get back to this set of videos because of this manga's wide array of issues that turned the script into a disorganised mess that took a while to properly structure. To compare the two manga covered so far, P3 has far less issues as an adaptation, but P4 works better as a standalone piece, simply by virtue of not reorganising all the important scenes the way P3 did. But I can't say I can recommend P4's manga to anyone. Sure, the art is still as good as P3's was, but it has too many issues holding it back as an adaptation of the game, and if someone wanted to experience the P4 narrative without playing the game or watching it on YouTube, the anime is a far better experience. I mean, the fact that such a popular entry of such a popular franchise got a manga adaptation which took like a decade to get an official English release, but fans didn't care enough about scanlating it to complete Volume 3 probably tells you everything you need to know. Still, the manga isn't the worst adaptation of P4 by virtue of not having Marie in it. And since I probably won't cover the anime in this series, I just want to say that the P4 Golden anime is just awful. Since P4 had already been animated, the Golden anime retold the first episode, then animated just the Golden stuff with Marie, by which I mean they adapted all the new scenes and put Marie in them even if she's not there in the game, which was my first exposure to the character, contributing heavily to my dislike of her. She's not as bad in the game, aside from Valentine's Day, but this super concentration of Marie is a terrible way to be introduced to a character the story really wants you to like as much as you do the core cast. I pray that A1 Pictures never adapts P5 Royal the same way. If you liked this video, why not subscribe and support me on Patreon like these fine people here? If not, then make sure to share it with your enemies so they can suffer along with you. Today's recommended video is The Secret Persona 4 Prequel Manga by Craftium. It discusses the P4 Magician prequel manga that focused on Yosuke, which I mentioned in the Persona A Line Through Time episode. Check it out!